Celine Marsh had memorized every word spoken inside the Obsidian Room for 11 months, and she had never once been asked for her opinion. She stood behind the polished mahogany bar at 10:15 on a Thursday, her thick fingers wrapped around a crystal decanter that caught the amber light and threw it in small, warm arcs across the ceiling. And she listened the way she had always listened, quietly, completely, without anyone in the room knowing she was doing it. The Obsidian Room was the legitimate face of something that had no legitimate face. A members-only jazz lounge in the financial district where the leather booths cost $3,000 a night, and the whiskey came in bottles that didn't have prices on them because the people who sat in those booths didn't need to ask. Celine was the bar's senior waitress, which meant she wore the same flat black uniform as the other staff, except hers had been tailored by hand because the standard issue didn't come in her size. And when the manager had pressed the seamstress about the alteration cost, she had told him quietly that she would pay for it herself. She had. The fabric sat snug across the wide shelf of her hips and draped over the full, heavy curve of her stomach, and she had stopped apologizing for what she looked like inside a room that charged admission for the pleasure of being seen. She moved between tables like something unhurried and inevitable. Her weight settled low in her center, her shoulders back, her tray carried flat and steady as a leveled horizon. The men in the booths did not look at her when she set down their glasses. They looked at each other and they talked, and Celine listened, and that was exactly how she had survived this job and kept the second job and paid for her mother's prescriptions and kept the lights on in the apartment in Canarsie where her cat, a large gray indifferent creature named after a dead philosopher, waited for her on the windowsill every morning at 6. She was 31 years old. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting that no one in this building knew about. She was, by every measurable standard, invisible, and she had decided a long time ago that invisible was not the worst thing a person could be. Fenris Voss had not arrived yet, but the room already knew he was coming. That was the thing about men like him. The knowledge of their approach traveled through a space before they did, rippling outward from the door through the bartenders and the floor managers and the junior waitstaff until it reached the polished edges of every surface and made them a little bit brighter, a little bit sharper, the way the air before a storm sharpens and makes every color more exact. Celine had watched this happen 11 times in 11 months. She had counted. She was the kind of person who counted things. She was restocking the bourbon shelf when Marco, the floor manager, appeared at her elbow with his clipboard held against his chest like a breastplate. He was 26 and perpetually anxious, and he smelled of the cheap aftershave he bought in bulk because his wife had told him once it was nice, and he had never thought to ask again. He said, "Mr. Voss has the private room tonight. He's bringing guests. 8 people, not 6. You'll need to reset the table." Celine said, "Already done." Marco blinked. Celine had reset it at 9:45 when she had overheard the call come through the reservation line, because she had long ago learned that the best way to manage this particular environment was to solve problems before anyone named them. Marco looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a person who is grateful and made uncomfortable by their gratitude simultaneously, and then he moved away, and she went back to counting the bourbon inventory in her head. The private room was off the main floor, through a door lined with dark emerald velvet, and accessed by a keypad that staff used a rotating 6-digit code to enter. Celine had committed every rotation to memory, not because she intended to use it, but because she could not help committing things to memory. It was the way her brain worked, relentless and involuntary, indexing everything it touched. At 10:47, the front door of the Obsidian Room opened, and the temperature dropped 2 degrees, and Fenris Voss walked in. She did not see it happen. She heard it in the quality of the silence that preceded it, the specific hush that fell over the nearest cluster of bartenders, the way snow falls. Not all at once, but decisively, the sound simply ceasing to exist. Then she looked up. He wore black, always black, a suit so perfectly constructed that it seemed less like fabric and more like a decision his body had made about how to exist in the world. He was enormously tall, his shoulders filling the doorway in a way that was less about width than about presence, the sense of a form that required more spatial consideration than ordinary forms. His hair was dark and cut close at the sides, his jaw a clean, angular line that his expression never softened. His eyes were obsidian, not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor, but genuinely, functionally dark, absorbing light in the way that very still water absorbs light, giving nothing back. He moved through the room without speaking to anyone, and 4 people fell into step around him, his security, and they moved like a weather system moving over flat land, inevitable and geographically indifferent. Celine watched him pass 8 feet from where she stood, and she noted, as she always noted, that he did not look at her. She noted it the way a scientist notes a consistent experimental result, without attachment, with precision, with a small private acknowledgement that the data confirmed the hypothesis. She picked up her tray and followed the party to the private room at a professional distance of 30 seconds, because that was her job, and Celine Marsh had never once failed to do her job. The private room held a round table of black lacquered wood ringed by 8 chairs upholstered in dark burgundy leather, and the light inside was warm and low, the kind of warm light that made every person in the room look like a version of themselves they preferred. Celine entered with a tray of still water and set glasses at each place without making sound, moving around the perimeter of the table while the men took their seats and continued a conversation she had arrived in the middle of. There were 8 of them, and she knew 3 by name. Fenris at the head position, though the table was round and the head position was simply wherever Fenris chose to sit, and his second, a man named Callum, with a scar below his left ear who handled logistics, and a guest called Dimitri, who had been in 3 times before, and whose account Celine had quietly noticed in the club's financial records, was coded to a shell company registered in Delaware that had no verifiable parent entity. She knew this because the club used accounting software that the manager believed only he had access to, and that Celine had navigated through a shared network drive after 11 months of patient, unintentional cataloging of every digital corner of the business she had been placed inside. She had not been looking for anything in particular when she found the Delaware shell. She had been trying to reconcile a $3,000 discrepancy in the spirits invoice, which was her additional unofficial responsibility because the bar manager, a man named Theo who was charming and catastrophically bad with numbers, had in a moment of desperate candor told Celine she was the only one he trusted with the spreadsheets. She had not mentioned her degree. She had simply helped. The discrepancy had led her to a second discrepancy, and that second discrepancy had led her to a pattern, and the pattern had taken 3 weeks to map completely, and what it showed, laid out across her personal laptop in the apartment in Canarsie, while her cat sat on her feet, and the philosopher-named creature watched her with magnificent disinterest, was that someone inside the Obsidian Room's financial structure was skimming. Not small amounts, not petty cash. Coordinated, systematic, precisely timed diversion of funds through layered sub-accounts that would look like operational overhead to anyone who wasn't looking for it, which was everyone except Celine, who was always looking for it, because she could not help looking. She poured whiskey for Fenris first, as protocol dictated. The bottle was a single malt that cost $400, and she handled it like a document. And she stepped back to the wall and she stood there, and she listened, and they talked about nothing she was supposed to hear, and she filed every word in the same meticulous interior library where she filed everything, and she did not consider what she was going to do about the discrepancy yet, because she was not ready. She needed one more piece and she didn't have it. She got it on a Saturday. Saturday nights at the Obsidian Room were louder, the music sharper, the clientele denser and more performatively relaxed in the way that very wealthy people become when they are performing relaxation for each other. Celine worked the main floor on Saturdays, navigating the crowd with the particular competence of someone who had learned to move a substantial body through tight spaces without apology or contraction. She did not make herself smaller to accommodate the room. The room accommodated her, or it didn't, and she moved through it anyway, because there was no version of the job that waited for her to feel comfortable before it needed doing. She was carrying a full tray to table 12 when she heard it. Not all of it, only the specific cluster of syllables that her trained ear had learned to catch and hold, account numbers, spoken in the specific casual brevity that people use when they believe themselves completely unheard. She caught 2 numbers and a name, and the name was not Dimitri, and it was not any of Fenris's known associates, and it was someone who was not supposed to be inside the financial architecture of the Obsidian Room at all. The name was Pietri, and Pietri was the club's own comptroller. She did not change her expression. She set the drinks down at table 12, and she thanked the guests, and she walked back to the bar, and she wrote the account numbers on the inside of her left wrist in ballpoint pen, pressed small and neat into the pale, soft skin below the cuff of her sleeve, and she covered it, and she went back to work. By 11 that night, she had the rest. She had been adding pieces for 3 weeks, and the final piece locked everything into a structure so clear and so damning that she sat in front of it for a very long time without moving, because what she was looking at was not a club manager skimming tip pooling funds. What she was looking at was an internal embezzlement operation that had diverted, conservatively estimated, $2.3 million over 18 months from accounts that she now understood, with complete and nauseating certainty, were not the legitimate club's accounts at all, but the operational accounts of something significantly larger and significantly less legal, and the person who had been stealing from that thing was Pietri, who reported directly to Callum, who stood 3 feet to the left of Fenris Voss at every meeting he attended. She understood immediately what this meant. It meant that either Callum was involved, which was operationally catastrophic for whoever Fenris was, or Callum was compromised, which was personally catastrophic for Callum. She understood what it also meant for herself, that she was sitting alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in Canarsie with a forensic map of a Mafia organization's internal fraud on her personal laptop and no plan for what to do with it, and that the information she now possessed made her, in the parlance of the world she had accidentally documented, a liability. She came to work on Monday and she was careful. She was always careful, but now careful meant something with sharper edges, and she felt those edges the way you feel a chip in a glass before you see it, just the faintest wrong resistance under your fingertip that tells you the surface has been compromised. She wore her usual uniform, the flat black that had been tailored to her actual body rather than the body she was apparently expected to apologize for not having, and she moved through her Monday shift with the steady, deliberate rhythm she had perfected over 11 months, and she did not speak of what she knew to anyone, and she tried to decide. The problem was that there was no version of this that ended cleanly. She could do nothing, which meant that whoever was being stolen from would eventually discover it through other means, and her presence in the building when they did discover it would make her a question mark at best and a suspect at worst. She could go to the police, which would require explaining how she had come to possess detailed forensic accounting documentation of an organized crime operations financial structure, which would require explaining that she had been quietly indexing the financial irregularities of her employer's illegal enterprise for 3 weeks, using credentials she had not been given and access she had not been granted, which would not end well. Or she could do the third thing, the thing she had been not thinking about since Saturday night, which was to take what she had directly to Fenris Voss, whom she had never spoken to, who did not know she existed, and lay it on whatever surface he used for things that required his attention. She was still choosing between these options at the end of her Tuesday shift, when the choosing was done for her. She was putting on her coat in the staff room when Marco appeared in the doorway with a look on his face that she had never seen on his face before. A specific compound of fear and reluctance that told her the message he was about to deliver was not his but someone else's, and that he wished profoundly he were not the one delivering it. He said, "Mr. Voss would like to see you." Not a question, not an invitation. She looked at Marco for exactly one beat and said, "Which room?" He said, "His office." She had not known there was an office. It was on the building's third floor, accessed through a staircase behind the velvet door that she had never had occasion to use, and it was nothing like the club below. No atmospheric lighting, no theater of wealth, just a large room with 3 windows and a desk that held only a lamp, a closed laptop, and a glass of water, and bookshelves along 2 walls that held actual books, with actual spines that appeared to have been actually read. Fenris Voss stood at the window with his back to the door when she entered, and he did not turn immediately, and she used those 3 seconds to settle her weight onto both feet evenly, and decide that she was not going to be afraid. She was afraid. She decided anyway. When he turned, his face was as she had always seen it from across the room, composed, angular, that dark gaze moving in a single unhurried sweep from her face to her feet and back again, and she felt it the way you feel a searchlight, not with discomfort, but with the vertiginous awareness of being genuinely seen, which was so unfamiliar that her body registered it as a kind of pressure. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "You've been going through the financial records." It wasn't a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "I found a discrepancy in the spirit's invoice." He looked at her. She said, "I know what you're thinking. That's not the whole answer." He said, "Give me the whole answer." She said, "I have a forensic accounting degree. I can't turn off what I know how to see. There was a pattern, and once I saw the beginning of it, I couldn't stop looking at the rest of it." The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that has weight and temperature, cool, dense, the kind that precedes either violence or decision, and she could not tell which. He said, "What did you find?" She opened the folder she had brought. She had not known she was coming here tonight, but she had been carrying the folder in her bag for 4 days, the way you carry an umbrella you're not sure you'll need, and she set it on the desk between them. And she told him. She told him everything. Account numbers, transaction patterns, timing, the Delaware shell, the layering methodology, and Pietri's name. She spoke clearly and without trembling, because the data was clean, and the data steadied her even when nothing else could. And when she finished, he was still looking at her, and the expression on his face had shifted by some margin she could not quantify. Not softer exactly, but differently hard, the way stone changes when you change the light on it. He said, "You've been working my floor for how long?" She said, 11 months. He said, "And no one knew you had this degree." She said, "I needed the income. I didn't think it was relevant." He said, very quietly, "It is extremely relevant." He reached for the folder and she watched his hands. Bare, she noticed. No gloves tonight. Large hands with the kind of deliberate control in their movement that spoke of a person who had trained himself never to reach for anything carelessly. He looked at the pages for 4 minutes without speaking, and she counted the minutes the way she counted everything else, and she waited. Then he said, without looking up, "Pietri," 1 word, delivered in the calm conversational tone of someone identifying a piece on a chessboard, and something in the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with her. Callum appeared within the hour, which told her that Fenris's communication with his second was immediate and absolute, and when Callum entered the office and saw Celine sitting in the chair across the desk from Fenris, he stopped moving entirely for exactly 1 second. Which was the most visible fear response she had ever seen from a man of his particular configuration. Fenris said, "Sit down, Callum." Callum sat. Fenris said, "Tell me about Pietri." Callum's face did the thing faces do when the body is choosing between two different lies and can't commit to either quickly enough. And in that half-second of visible calculation, Celine understood that Callum had not been running the embezzlement, but had known about it and chosen to say nothing, which was its own category of problem in the organizational structure she had been quietly documenting for 11 months. She did not look at Callum. She looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap, her left wrist still faintly marked from Saturday's pen, the account numbers ghosts under the healed skin. Callum said, "I became aware of an irregularity 3 weeks ago." Fenris said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to become geological. Callum said, "I was gathering information before I brought it to you." Fenris said, in the exact same tone he used for everything, "Celine brought it to me first." And the way he said her name, simply, as a fact, the same weight he gave to everything he said, struck her somewhere below the ribs, in a way she was not prepared for, because it was the first time she had heard her name in his voice, and it sounded different there than it sounded anywhere else, settled and specific, like something placed rather than spoken. He had known her name. He had known it without being told just now, which meant he had known it before this conversation, which meant someone had told him her name, which meant she had been less invisible than she had believed, and the realization was so disorienting that she pressed her feet harder into the floor to stay located in her own body. Callum was moved from the room shortly after that, the logistics handled with an efficiency she did not witness and did not ask about. When they were alone again, Fenris stood from behind the desk and walked to the window, and she watched his profile, the jaw, the controlled stillness of a body that had learned to express nothing involuntarily. He said, "You could have gone to the police," she said. "I considered it." He said, "Why didn't you?" She said, after a moment, "Because I didn't know yet whether what I had would protect me or bury me, and I needed to know which." He turned and looked at her, and something crossed his face that moved too quickly for her to catalog, and she was very good at cataloging. He said, "Smart." She said, "It's just math." He said, "No, most people with what you had would have run." She said, "I don't run." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "No, you don't," and it sounded like something he had known before she told him. 3 days later, Pietri was gone, which was the word Callum's replacement, a quiet, competent man named Rourke, used when she asked what had happened, and she did not ask follow-up questions because the answer was not information she needed in order to continue existing safely, and she was precise about what she needed. She was behind the bar on Thursday night, doing what she had always done, and she had begun to believe that the whole architecture of the last week was simply going to recede into the general fabric of her life at the Obsidian Room, become another catalogued fact in her interior library, filed under the heading of things that happened and changed nothing. Then Fenris walked in at 10:47, and he did not go to the private room. He came to the bar. He sat on the stool directly in front of her, and he placed both hands flat on the bar top, bare, no gloves, and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the nearest bartender found a reason to be somewhere else, and the 2 feet of bar between them became the only space in the room that mattered. He said, "Pour me something." She reached for the single malt, and he said, "Not that. Pour me what you'd choose." She paused. She reached under the bar for a bottle of Armagnac that she had suggested Theo order 6 weeks ago, and that no one had ordered since, and she poured 2 fingers and set it in front of him, and he picked it up without looking at it, still looking at her. He said, "You're still here." She said, "I still work here." He said, "You could work somewhere else, something more commensurate." She said, "I like this job." He said, "You like knowing what's in the room." She said after a moment, "Yes." He said, "So do I." He drank the Armagnac slowly, and she stood across the bar from him, and she felt the searchlight quality of his attention the way she had felt it in the office, not diminishing but accumulating. adding up to something she didn't have a formula for yet. He said, "The $3,000 discrepancy in the spirit's invoice." She said, "Theo's invoicing the same vendor twice under different line codes. He's not stealing, he just can't read his own shorthand." He almost smiled. She saw it happen in the corner of his mouth, the smallest possible concession, and it struck her as one of the most extraordinary things she had ever seen in this room, which was saying something. He said, "I want you on the account side, legitimate and otherwise." She said, "I know what otherwise means in this context." He said, "I know you know." The room continued to exist around them, the music low, the bourbon bottles throwing amber arcs of light, and she stood in her flat black uniform that had been tailored to her actual body, and she breathed and she said, "If I do this, I need certain things understood." He said, "Tell me." She told him. She said she would not be managed, she would not be hidden, she would not carry information she was not permitted to verify, and she would not make herself smaller to fit a role that was sized for someone's comfort rather than her competence. She said each of these things in the same clear, steady tone she had used to lay the forensic map of Pietri's embezzlement on his desk, and he listened to each condition with the same absolute attention he gave to everything, and when she finished he said, "Agreed." She said, "Just like that." He said, "Just like that." She looked at him across the bar in the warm amber light, and she said, "You knew my name before I told it to you in the office." It was not a question either. He looked at her and said, "You've been in this room for 11 months. Did you really think you were invisible?" She did not answer because the answer was yes, and the yes felt suddenly like a small, removable belief she had been carrying for much longer than 11 months, and she was not ready to set it down yet. He said softly, the baritone dropping to something that was almost private, "You were never invisible to me." She pressed her feet into the floor and looked at him, and the room continued and the music played, and somewhere behind her the bartender came back and pretended to count bottles, and Celine Marsh stood in the exact center of the room she had spent 11 months moving through, as if she were background, and she felt, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, like the subject of the sentence she was standing in. The federal investigation began 6 weeks later. This was not Celine's doing, or not entirely. The forensic trail she had mapped had already intersected with a larger ongoing inquiry, and when the investigators found Pietri and Pietri's accounting trail led somewhere interesting, the somewhere interesting turned out to be a sealed case that had been building quietly for 2 years, and the case had subpoenas attached to it, and 2 of those subpoenas arrived at the Obsidian Room on a Tuesday morning, addressed to its operational accounts and to any person with knowledge of those accounts' management, which included, because she had now been formally positioned in that role for 6 weeks, Celine. She was told about the subpoena by Rourke, who delivered the information with the controlled neutrality of a person who has learned that the delivery of bad news should never add texture to the news itself. She was in Fenris's office when Rourke told them both, and she watched Fenris receive the information the way he received everything, without movement, without visible reaction, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes moving to Celine with an immediacy that told her the first question his mind had organized was not about the investigation, but about her position inside it. He said, "Are you listed by name?" Rourke said. "Not yet," Fenris said. "She will be." He said it not with alarm, but with the specific certainty of a person who maps terrain accurately, regardless of his preferences about what the terrain contains. Then he looked at Celine and said, "This changes what you know and what you can say." She said, "I know what I know, and I know what it means." He said, "They'll put you in a room and they'll ask you questions." She said, "I know how to answer questions." He said, "Celine," just her name. The same way he had said it in the office the first time, placed rather than spoken, and she looked at him and the room was very quiet and she said, "I'm not going to collapse. I am not going to do anything that isn't considered, but I need you to understand that if I'm put under oath, I answer honestly, and that is not a variable I will negotiate." The silence was the cool, dense, geological kind again, and she held it without filling it, because she had learned that the right silences were the ones you didn't rush. He said, "I know." She said, "You know." He said, "I knew that before I brought you to this office." He stood and came around the desk, and she remained in her chair, and he crouched to her eye level, his forearms on his knees, his dark eyes level with hers, and it was the most deliberate gesture of equivalence she had ever seen from a man who operated at a permanent altitude above every other person in every room he entered. He said, very quietly, "What you have is protected. The information you hold is defensible in ways you don't yet know, because you don't yet know all the ways I have been watching this particular situation develop." She said, "You have a parallel documentation." He said, "I have had a parallel documentation for 4 months. She stared at him. She said, "You were already mapping Pietri." He said, "I was already mapping Pietri." She said, "And you let me find it." He said, "I watched you find it. There is a difference." She looked at him at eye level in the warm light of an office that held actual books on actual shelves, and she said, "You were testing me." He said, "No, I was watching someone who was doing, alone and without support and without asking anything of anyone, the exact thing that people I pay substantial salaries to had not managed to do. That is not a test. That is a discovery." She breathed. She said, "What does that mean for the subpoena?" He said, "It means you are going to testify truthfully, and you are going to be protected, and what you say is going to confirm information that has already been legally documented through a channel that has no connection to you." She said, "A parallel channel." He said, "A parallel channel." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "You should have told me." He said, "Yes, just that." Just yes, without defense or deflection, delivered in the same even tone that he delivered everything, and the simplicity of it was more disarming than any argument would have been. And she looked at this man crouched at her eye level in the voluntary position of something other than dominance, and she felt the second of the two things she had not had a formula for yet begin to resolve into something she recognized. She testified on a Wednesday in March in a federal building with fluorescent lighting that made every person inside it look like a version of themselves they would not have chosen, and she wore a dress the color of midnight blue that Fenris had commissioned without asking, and left in a garment bag outside her office door the day before, and the fabric was heavy and soft, and it was cut for her actual body, not to conceal the wide, heavy shelf of her hips, or the full curve of her stomach, or the generous weight of her chest, but to move with those things, to follow the geography of her form the way good fabric is supposed to. And when she had put it on in her apartment in Canarsie, she had stood in front of the mirror for a moment that stretched longer than she expected, because what she saw was not a body in a dress that fit despite itself, but a body that the dress had been built around, a body that had been the starting point rather than the problem to be solved, and she had pressed her feet into the floor and taken a breath and allowed that to be true. She sat at the table in the federal room, and she answered every question clearly and without hesitation, and she was precise, and she was comprehensive, and her testimony ran to 4 hours across 2 sessions. And at no point did she say anything that was not exactly true, and at no point did anything she said contradict the parallel documentation that Fenris's legal team had constructed through legitimate investigative channels over the previous 4 months. When she walked out of the federal building into the gray March light, she found Rourke leaning against a black car at the curb, and she got in without being asked, because she had learned to stop performing surprise at things that were not surprising. Fenris was in the car. He was looking at her, and he said nothing for a moment, and she said nothing. And then he said, "How do you feel?" She said, "Tired." He said, "Hungry." It wasn't a question. She said, "Extremely." He said, "Good." He told the driver somewhere she didn't hear, and the car moved, and she sat beside him in the warm interior of the car, and the city moved past the windows, and she was very tired, and she let herself be tired without managing it. After a while he said, "You were extraordinary in there." She said, "You weren't in there." He said, "No, but I know what you gave them, and I know what it cost." She looked at her hands in her lap, the left wrist, the account numbers long gone, just smooth skin now. She said, "It cost less than I thought it would." He said, "Because you were prepared." She said, "Because I had documentation." He said, "Celine." She looked up. He said, "Because you are someone who does not break when the room is designed to break people." She looked at him, and the January cold light from the window fell across his face, and she thought that she had spent 11 months in the same building as this man, and had filed him under the heading of things that were not for her, a category she had developed early and maintained rigorously, a category populated by most things she wanted, and she thought that the category was wrong in the specific way that categories built from shame rather than fact were always wrong, precise in their architecture and completely incorrect in their conclusion. She said, "I've been invisible for a long time." He said, "I know." She said, "I thought that was a choice." He said, "It was, and you made it, and I'm asking you to make a different one." She looked at him in the warm interior of the moving car in the gray March light, and she said, "What choice?" He said, "Let me see you, fully, the way I've been seeing you for 11 months without your permission." Her breath shifted. She said, "That's a very specific request." He said, "I'm a very specific person." She looked at him, and she was 31 years old, and she was tired, and she was wearing a dress the color of midnight blue that had been built around her body, and she said, "All right." He reached across the space between them and placed one large bare hand over both of hers in her lap, not gripping, not claiming, just placing, the warmth of it entirely steady, his thumb settling against her wrist where the account numbers used to be. And he said, "You were never background. You were always the center of the frame. You just couldn't see it yet." She let that be true. She pressed her feet into the floor of the moving car and she let it be true. And the gray city moved around them, and the car carried them somewhere she didn't know yet, and she decided that not knowing yet was, for once, exactly enough. If this story reached something true in you, that particular feeling when someone who was told to be invisible refuses, finally, to comply, please hit the like button and let the algorithm know this kind of story deserves to exist. Share it with someone who has spent too long standing at the edge of their own room. Subscribe if you want more stories built around women who carry their intelligence and their bodies, and their refusal to apologize for either, as the most dangerous combination in any room they walk into. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment Celine stopped being background for you? I want to read every answer.